Living in the Midwest of the United States, thinking about how I'm going to make it through winter is not something that I necessarily have to really work hard at. I have the luxury of having a grocery store that if worst case scenario comes, I can go to the store at any time and pick some food up. But in the time period that we study, which is specifically the late 17th century through the early 19th century, folks did not have that luxury, especially folks here in North America. You were constantly preparing for the hardships of winter, and the hardship, that word is not to be taken lightly because depending on where folks lived, it could be very, very bleak. For my generation living here in the United States, I think that canning is almost a novelty practice where we know that our grandparents did it, and then our parents not so much, but maybe some, depending especially geographically where you live. And then we do that because we want to understand how it's done and why it was done, but not necessarily because we need that food to get us through. So some of us will can and we'll do like canned tomatoes or something like that. We'll make some salsa, we'll do things like that. People of my generation are interested in that, but it's not something that we have to count on. Now, in our time period that we're talking about, folks had to preserve food. And it goes well past canning because they had to have a protein source, they had to have meat, they had to have their root vegetables stored, they had to have their grains stored. Grains are what we want to talk about today, specifically oatmeal and oats. But all of that had to be gathered, all of that had to be prepared, and you had to have a good place to store those things. And so all year long, you're just looking forward to getting through the winter, and not looking forward to it as in like positive anticipation, but almost dread, but you have to be prepared. Now, oats were not a staple crop everywhere, but there are specific regions, mainly Northern England and Scotland, really counted on oats. They needed to do that because of not only the cost of wheat, but also the hardships of growing wheat. They had to find something that could grow where they were. And so they made oats work in all of the circumstances that you would usually use something like wheat. They also used barley, and all of these different grains can be used as a replacement for wheat. At least not necessarily a one-to-one replacement, but they can get the job done. So the other day I was hanging out at my parents' house and we were doing some things, and somehow the conversation of oatmeal came up, and my dad was like, "When's the last time you had oatmeal?" And I was kind of like, "Oh, I had oatmeal like a week ago." And he's like, "I don't think I've had oats or even thought of oats since I was a kid." And so I went through the cookbooks of the time period and I was like, okay, what are the ways that they're commonly using oats? And it's incredible because there are ways that we don't really think about. So they're making obviously oatmeal dishes, but some of those oatmeal dishes are very savory and they have meat, onions, herbs, root vegetables. They're making oat cakes, oat bread. They're doing some boiled oat pudding kind of things. One of the other major things that they were using oats for is making beer, which is not something that we think about a ton. I guess every once in a while you'll find an oatmeal stout or something like that, but they were using oat to make light beers all the time. So in the preservation process for their oats, what they're going to do is remove the hulls and make what we call oat groats. And so that's the whole grain where just the hull is removed, and they can store it that way. But they'll also mill it, and they'll mill it kind of coarse, and then they'll mill it super fine. So a coarse grind today, what you can find in the grocery store would be something like steel cut oats, although it's not exactly how they were doing it in the time period. Or you can sometimes find stone ground oats. And then you can find oat flour, which is what they were using for a lot of instances when they're making some kind of bread out of it. Unfortunately, with the bread, they would have to use something to be a binder because oats don't act like wheat and they don't really stick together, so bread will just crumble. In that circumstance, they would use like more milk or something like that as a binder. I went looking for some readings to see how people were generally thinking about oatmeal, and this one came from The Accomplished Housewife from 1745. She says, "Oatmeal is the most wholesome. 'Tis a light opening diet and good for asthmatics, as it helps to bring up the phlegm. 'Tis beneficial likewise in a vaporish constitution, as it licks up the sharp humor of the bowels." In that particular instance, they're talking about the perceived health benefits of this grain, which I don't think a lot of people today will look at a particular grain and say, "Oh, that's good for an asthmatic," but they were certainly thinking that. Now, in a treatise of the art of bread making in 1805, the author says that oats were first used in Northern England, they moved to Scotland, and it's their prized grain. And he says those are two areas that have always produced a healthy and vigorous race of men, which is pretty crazy to think of, but they're saying this is good stock. This is good for people. This is the healthy grain, and we think it's the best. Now, speaking of a treatise of an art of bread making, this is a really interesting read talking about how folks needed to work with oats to make bread where they couldn't have any other grain. Take a peck of oatmeal and an ounce of salt. Knead them up into a stiff paste with warm water. Roll out into thin cakes and bake them in an oven or over the embers. This kind of bread is much used in Scotland among the lower order of people, who, from long custom, prefer it to the best wheaten bread. This is a really interesting recipe that I found, so I went ahead and baked it up last night because we're not going to actually make this in the video, but I want to talk about it because this is essentially what we call the baked oatmeal today, and that's very popular. A lot of people do that in the mornings, or somebody even said it kind of looks like a Cliff Bar, but really this was just oatmeal that you make over the stove like normal, and then you make it so it's so thick that you can barely turn a spoon through it. You mix some sugar, some salt, a little bit of brandy, and some currants, put it in the oven, and it comes out like this. And this was a very, very popular kind of dish that they would have in the time period. Sometimes it would have suet, sometimes it would have butter and eggs, but this is a very simplified version. They get very ornate to where you even have puff paste all around the outside, but there are tons of recipes for this, and this is a very popular way for people to eat oatmeal in the time period. When I was looking for recipes for oats, I went straight for the Elizabeth Cleland book, A New and Easy Method of Cookery, because it's a Scottish cookbook. I knew I'd be able to find some oat stuff there. One of them was for an oat pancake, which is really interesting, and I hadn't thought about that before. But this pottage of herbs and oats I thought was really, really neat because we don't tend to think about savory oatmeal where I come from. So this is the recipe. To make a pottage of chopped herbs, mince very fine spinach, chives, parsley, marigold flowers, succory, strawberry, and violet leaves. Stamp them with oatmeal in a bowl. Pat chopped greens in with it. You may either put broth or water to them. If water, boil a good piece of butter in it. Put sippets in the dish and pour it over them. So one of the challenging things about this recipe is they're using terms of measurement that Scots used in the time period that we don't use anymore, and they don't translate exactly the way that you would think. So I did some looking last night, and a choppin is 28 ounces, but that's fluid ounces. So it's going to be a little bit tricky, as a munchkin is 14 ounces. So we're going to have to play with this until we find what we believe is the right consistency, although I don't think it's going to be too difficult. So essentially what we're going to do here is we're going to make oatmeal, and when it starts to come together and starts to thicken up a little bit, we're going to incorporate all of these herbs and these green leafy vegetables. Now, I don't have access to some of these things. It's not seasonal to have violet leaves and strawberry leaves and marigolds, but what I did get was the parsley and the chives, and I have a bunch of sweet herbs that we're gonna mix in there. So I got some sage and some rosemary, and I think some basil as well. So whatever you have at your disposal for herbs and for green kind of freshness, as long as you also have some onion in there, because we gotta get that flavor in, go ahead and use that. This should be a really simple recipe to make. Now, at the end of it, we're gonna grill some bread up and we're gonna toast that so we have our sippets, and this is gonna go over top of it. Here we are, we've got our oatmeal on our sippets, our savory oatmeal. I haven't had anything quite like this before. I have had savory oatmeal dishes, usually with like meat and onions and that sort of thing, which you see a lot in the time period as well. This one is just herb-based. This is for a very frugal meal. And let's see what we've got here. I'm just gonna get a bite with everything. I don't expect it to be terribly awesome. We'll see what happens. I was wrong. It's really awesome. So you get the crunchiness of that toast. I think that makes it, because the oatmeal has this really creamy texture, and those herbs really sing. So that's really nice because you've got the chive coming through, you've got the parsley, you can taste all of the different herbs that you put in there. Rosemary comes through, it always does. But it tastes very fresh and light, even though it's a filling dish. And so this would make somebody very happy, especially in a meager situation. So I think that this is worth a try. I think especially if you want to taste something that's quintessential, like poor food 18th century, this works out really well. But getting you through the winter, this is a great lunch. Somebody would be very happy to have this. and it fits right into that surviving the winter kind of mindset. So it works really well.